The 3:30 p.m. meeting of the Bakersfield City Council is now in session.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to call to order the 3:30 regular City Council meeting of June 28th, 2023. Madam Clerk, call the roll, please.
Mayor Go.
Here.
Vice Mayor Gonzalez.
Here.
Councilmember Arias.
Here.
Councilmember Weir.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
I'm here.
Councilmember Freeman. Councilmember Gray.
Here.
And Councilmember Core.
Thank you. In keeping with Council's resolution, the public statements portion is now divided into two periods. There's a period for items listed on the meeting agenda and items not on the meeting agenda. Statements for items listed on this afternoon's agenda are given a 2-minute time limit, 20 minutes total per agenda item. Statements regarding items not on the agenda are also given a 2-minute time limit, 20 minutes total. If you have written comments that are longer than your verbal statement, give them to the clerk, who will give copies to the council. If you're here to make a public statement, please fill out a public speaker card and give your completed card to the city clerk. We ask that you mark whether you're here to speak on an item listed on this afternoon's agenda or on a matter not on the agenda. Speakers who do not identify a specific agenda item will be presumed speakers for the non-agenda portion. Those speakers will be called during the non-agenda portion of the meeting. Madam Clerk, do we have any public speakers regarding items listed on this afternoon's agenda?
Mayor Go, we have not received any speaker cards for items listed on tonight's agenda, nor for non-agenda items.
Thank you. Next item, please.
Reports item 3A, City Charter Independent Review.
Thank you. Mr. Clegg.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We set this up as a workshop item in our afternoon session to give us time to walk through and have a good discussion on the topic. This is resulting from a referral that was made initially late last year, and then we did a presentation earlier this year on options to move forward with considerations around charter review. And at that time, City Council had requested that staff engage with Moss Adams to conduct an independent review of our charter. And we have Tammy Lohr here from Moss Adams to provide that presentation to Council, and she may give some of this context as well. But just to remind Council, this is really a review of our charter compared to benchmark cities and also compared to best practices, either seen through National League of Cities or the International City County Management Association. This is a comparison of how our charter compares to those other pieces. There will be some staff feedback about recommendations for how we act in response to the analysis, but this is really just an objective comparison of our charter to these other best practices. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Tammy.
Welcome.
Thank you. Am I on? Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for having me this afternoon. As Christian said, my name is Tammy Lohr. I'm a senior manager with Moss Adams, and I led the City Charter Review engagement. So today what we'll do is we'll review our purpose, scope, and methodology, start out by reviewing some charter best practices in the industry, and then review the high priority charter revisions in some detail, and then provide a high-level summary of the medium priority charter revisions, and then open it up for discussion, of course. So to get started, we were engaged to help the city evaluate its city charter, to identify opportunities to modernize and streamline your charter, and be current with industry best practices, as well as your peers. In addition to that, we did look specifically at operational risks, operational inefficiencies that were presented by your charter provisions, and potential areas that could be moved into municipal code so that it allowed greater flexibility as times evolve. To do that, we completed an independent scan of the Bakersfield City Charter. We developed a prioritized list of areas to be able to evaluate and prioritized those areas into high, medium, and low priority. We conducted peer analysis using the 12 city peers that the council has identified, and then we conducted best practice research on each of those high, medium, and low priority areas as well. So to start out with, before we get specifically into the Bakersfield Charter, I just wanted to review some of the best practices when it comes to city charters in general. So the city charter is essentially your constitution. It sets up your framework and the foundational principles for how your municipality will operate. So some of the elements that are typically included are listed here. What I'll highlight is the form of government, powers and authority for each government branch, election and voting procedures, as well as the charter amendment process. But of course, many other factors are typically included here as well. In addition to that, it's sometimes helpful to identify what things typically belong in city charter and what things typically belong in municipal code. So again, your city charter has that basic framework. It sets out your form of government. It sets out some of those high-level expectations. And it is created and amended through formal processes that require your voters to approve of any potential changes to those procedures. Municipal code, on the other hand, essentially helps you operationalize your charter provisions in many ways, as well as provides specific local rules and regulations for the operation of the municipality. So you cover a lot of additional details around zoning, land use, public safety, personnel provisions, and a variety of other factors. And those municipal codes can obviously be created and modified by City Council, which allows the city to be able to evolve those procedures over time while keeping with the spirit that's mentioned in the city charter. Okay, so with that, we're going to start out by reviewing our 5 high priority charter revision areas. The first area was related to salaries for council members and the mayor. So the Bakersfield City Charter is unique by having the amounts that are paid to council members as well as the mayor listed within your charter, and to require that adjustments be submitted to referendum for approval. None of the other peer cities that we evaluated had salary amounts listed in their charter. Many of the peers sometimes had provisions which stated that whatever their salary level would be would align with the California State General Code, or government code, that says what those amounts should be for general law cities. So it says we're going to align with that, or we're not going to exceed that dollar amount. Based on the available data that we were able to get, Bakersfield salaries do appear to be generally lower than peer cities. We'll review that on the next slide. But in general, it's a best practice to avoid stating specific salary amounts in your charter. It's very easy for those numbers to become outdated over time. I believe that the last time that your charter section in this area was reviewed was in the 80s, and so you can imagine what inflation has done to those numbers, and you haven't really kept pace with that, especially in the last 2 years where we've seen record levels of inflation. And in general, best practices also suggest that salary adjustments be made by ordinance. And the way that that would work is that if you chose to increase or adjust salaries, that would be a vote that takes place prior to the election, and that would only impact incoming council members, so that you're not voting in self-interest. Here we show, and I'm sorry this is a little small up here, but some of the salary comparisons that we were able to identify for council members as well as for the mayor. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we have annual council member salaries. Bakersfield is certainly the lowest that is listed here. There's a wide variety of different levels that are provided by different cities. We were unable to determine whether these municipalities deemed their city council members to be part-time or full-time. Many city council members are technically part-time, although they will state that the work is more than part-time, but that has not been officially documented in any of the procedures or documents that we were able to evaluate. On the right-hand side, you'll see the annual mayor's salary. You're right sort of in the low to middle range for those. The items that are highlighted in green indicate that that mayor is a full-time mayor for that municipality. And so the other unhighlighted items or unhighlighted cities show the compensation for the other mayors that are not considered full-time. So again, you're not the lowest on the list for the mayor's salary, but you're certainly not the highest either. Okay, the next area that we considered high priority was the maintenance of the 3 civil service boards. So Bakersfield Charter requires there to be 3 civil service boards, 1 for police, 1 for fire, and 1 for miscellaneous employees. And that creates administrative burden because each one of those civil service boards has different rules, schedules, procedures, timing, and impacts different recruitments that are going on for each of those different departments. We found that 3 peer cities did have the requirement to have 1 civil service board in their city charters, whereas 2 did not have any requirements related to that. And no best practices were found related to the number of civil service boards that any municipality should have. The next area that we looked at relates to your personnel provisions. So you have some pretty detailed personnel provisions included in your charter. So you have requirements for how long individuals have to serve within your public safety departments in order to promote. You also have probation periods specified within your charter, and you require the use of exams and eligible lists to rank candidates for hiring. None of this is necessarily that different from what peers do, but it does differ in terms of where that information is housed. So typically this information is included within municipal code rather than the city charters. And you can see that over on the right-hand side on the peer practices. So only 1 peer city, which was Sacramento, included tenure requirements for their public safety department in order to promote into a new position. And then 3 peer cities did also require the use of exams and eligible lists. Again, that is very common, but it can promote a longer hiring process, which then can potentially mean that you're losing out on candidates that are seeking a job in a more timely manner. According to best practices, you should work on designing your personnel practices to be flexible and really focus on that merit-based principles so that we're able to invest in individuals, invest in career development, and promote people based on what they're able to provide for the city rather than their tenure. The next area that we reviewed relates to your contracting processes and restrictions. So you have a couple provisions within your city charter where there's a lot of detail about exactly what this needs to look like. You have a section that requires your contracts to be in writing, numbered, and kept in a book, as well as countersigned by the finance director. Other peer cities don't typically have the information. They may require the city clerk to be able to maintain a listing of all contracts. In practice, the city clerk, of course, does have that listing. However, it's probably not kept in a physical book at this point. Instead, there are other ways that we're able to house that information. You also have a section that prohibits lighting contracts to be in effect for longer than 1 year, which is not consistent with current practices, and also presents some administrative burdens if you are requiring those contracts to be renewed on an annual basis. So according to peer practices, not a lot of detail in these areas and those other peer charters. And then it is a best practice to have those organizational and operational details pulled out of the charter and into municipal code so that, again, you would be able to modernize these items over time so that we're not necessarily referencing a book, but maybe a consolidated listing of contracts. The last area that is within the high priority charter revisions relates to exercising rights without franchise criminal punishments. I'll start out by explaining exactly what that means. So exercising rights without franchise in this city charter section refers to exercising rights without franchise for utilities. So essentially a utility provider that is using your public infrastructure like electricity or wiring or broadband without having an agreement with you, the city, in order to do that. So that's what that section is referring to. Your charter defines this to be a crime. It defines it as a misdemeanor. It sets fines for it. It sets jail time for this offense. And we don't typically see the city charters used to be serving as a penal code. And this also may not align with California's penal code. And again, the fine amounts for this are $500 or $100 a day. That may or may not actually deter someone from potentially doing this with the inflation that might have existed since this was last revised, I think, in 1964. Okay. With that, I'm going to summarize our medium priority charter revisions. So we have a couple of areas that were also flagged for additional analysis here. You have an article that allows a special election for vacant city council positions. That is not uncommon. Typically what we'll see is that you would vote on who would fill that council position, and then if you're unable to reach a majority vote, then it would be referred to a special election. Special elections can be very expensive and very time consuming in order to achieve. And so that's the typical option that we usually see for municipalities. You have another article that has a lot of details on job descriptions and residency requirements for some of your key city officials, like your city manager, your finance director, and your city attorney. Right now, California state law prohibits residency requirements for public employees. And again, those position requirements that are listed in your charter are likely to evolve over time. And so making sure that the functions are listed in the charter, whereas the job descriptions are pulled out, and in order to make sure that we're providing the best possible job descriptions when we're doing our recruitment is helpful. You also have a lot of specifics on your personnel system in the charter. We've reviewed some of those already, but some of those items can prevent the ability for the city to be a flexible provider and a flexible employer for folks, and that, again, may deter your recruitment and retention efforts if everything is sort of boxed in based on those charter revisions and may not be keeping up with modern practices. And lastly, we identified a gap within your city charter in that it does not currently include conflict of interest provisions. And we do typically see some conflict of interest provisions within the city charter, and then procedures for exactly what that looks like in municipal code or in board policy. And that's it.
Thank you. Mr. Clegg, do you have any concluding comments before we go to council?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I do have a few suggestions, and I think I'll give them now just so that it facilitates, I think, discussion in the right places. Because based on even some early feedback that I've shared with council members and kind of where we're at and some of the other strategic initiatives of the city, while this objective analysis is, I think, really valuable to us, there may be other factors for us in considering whether or not it's worth the return on investment to go and make a big charter change at this point in time. And so I see the buckets of these potential charter amendments into a couple of different pieces. One is just cleanup language. There are some sections that are probably not going to be controversial and probably could use a little bit of cleanup, and it would be pretty low barrier to go and to consider those. Another bucket would be some of the civil service and personnel. I'll come back to that bucket in a moment. And the last bucket would be, maybe some of those more substantive items that I would look for council direction on, do we pursue, such as council pay, council vacancy, and the conflict of interest. While there's not a major issue about conflict of interest because we're covered under the FPPC, we have state law that dictates conflict of interest for California cities. That there's, given the absence of that in our charter, is there a desire to make a philosophical statement about our values and not promoting conflicts of interest. But coming back to the cleanup and to the civil service piece, I would agree in my own assessment that it is atypical to see the level of detail that we see in our charter that dictates about civil service. However, there are a few minor areas that cause challenge for us, like it dictates specific timeframes for a probationary period, let's say for fire personnel. And fire would like that probationary period actually to be extended to give more opportunity for those employees to demonstrate their ability to perform the job duty. That's probably the most specific issue around charter language that inhibits our ability to be flexible and adopt rules that benefit us. Outside of that very specific example, most of the other charter pieces are not so problematic that I would say, we need to tackle that right away. And in light of our recent closed negotiations with our labor partners and some other work that we need to do, I'm not sure that the timing around civil service is imminent that we go and take on that big body of work, because frankly, it's probably the biggest and most complicated thing to take on in a charter consideration. So then my recommendation to council really is we consider some of these cleanups that might be pretty low barrier and move forward on those, and then welcome some council discussion and feedback on some of the other more substantive items. But the personnel and civil service items, again, I'm open to council feedback on that, but I feel that those are items that the timing may be better at a future date, but we have this objective analysis already done that outlines what would be a regular practice when we do decide the timing is better to take those ones on.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, and Mr. Clegg, thank you for your analysis. I think there's several pieces here that we have to sort of tease out. First and foremost, clearly there are a number of items here in articles that we have to address. I think the question then is, when do we address these, and do we try to tackle more or less in 2024? And I'm sure all of us on the dais have our analysis on what might be best in terms of how do we approach this. My opinion is we take the long view and we systematically, through a series of election cycles, address pieces of this charter. But that, of course, is a council decision, and I'm happy to develop an alternative strategy. My question, though, is if we were to take several articles to the voters in an election, would each article appear as separate ballot measures? Would they be consolidated under one measure? Ms. Gennaro, maybe we don't know that yet, or can you help me understand that?
Sure, Mayor, Vice Mayor, great question. And again, most of you remember that was one of the dilemmas that we went through when we recently amended the charter for the Chief of Police. So number one, I think it really depends on which articles we're talking about. Certainly, if there is a chance that one may pass and one may not pass, then that needs to be analyzed in order to do it together, right? Because you wouldn't want to have an inconsistent result. So I think the short answer to your question is it really depends which articles the council decides to move forward with, and how that language reads. And again, I would also mention, please keep in mind that we've done these charter amendments before several times in my career. It's very difficult to get them to pass. I'm not telling you that to lean, one way or the other. But I think that history has shown the more a council puts before the voters, the more likely the charter amendment is to fail, as a general rule.
Mr. Clegg?
If I may respond just a moment, Mayor, my response to that is I would agree with you. I think there is a hazard in too much information and overcomplicating the issue, and there's enough to debate, and I think there's opportunity for us to address a lot of these issues over the longer term.
And I just wanted to add real quickly the fiscal consideration for do you batch them or do you separate them out? Each individual ballot measure is an additional cost, and we don't have the most up-to-date estimates, but it's probably close to $100,000 for every ballot, distinct ballot measure you place on the ballot.
Okay, may I move over to the salary comparisons? And I just was curious, Bakersfield has a population of 410,000 people now. Oakland has a population of 430,000 people, only 20,000 additional citizens in Oakland, and Long Beach has 451,000. I'm not sure, have we taken a look at both Oakland and Long Beach as comparable cities?
We did not. We only looked at the 12 cities that we were provided as Bakersfield peers.
Okay. I'd like to ask that we look at both Long Beach and Oakland also for comparables. Look, I'll cut to the chase. I think, it's very clear none of us on the city council ran for city council in order to get rich. We did it as an act of public service, and we want to do the best for the community. That should be abundantly clear. I think the other thing, though, that is clear is that there's so many people out in our community, in our city, who also want to serve and would like an opportunity to lead our community forward, but simply can't do it because of basic economics. They are prohibited by real financial constraints. Either they're a single parent trying to make ends meet, trying to raise a household, or they're a younger person trying to start out in their careers, but they too would like an opportunity to serve on this dais. And I think we're losing an opportunity in terms of having quality leadership by these constraints in terms of salary. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily move towards a full-time city council, but I do believe that we ought to find a salary adjustment for the council that is that allows for more individuals to participate in this process. It's no secret, I do not plan to be on the city council beyond 2024. And so I think I'm probably in the best position to make a referral tonight for staff to move forward in exploring this question in terms of city council member pay and compensation, and developing a measure for the 2024 election. Ms. Gennard, do we need a motion, or is a referral sufficient?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, I think at this point a referral is sufficient and we can come back to staff. That's my understanding in talking with the city manager and how he would like to move forward with this.
Okay, thank you, and thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Freeman.
Mr. Clegg, would we dovetail, if we ever did put amendments to the charter on the ballot, would we dovetail those with our regular elections? So I would think we would, but just for efficiency, but.
Absolutely, council member. We would look to in a consolidated election, and in fact, ballot measures are required to go at a general election. You can't do it at a special election or an off-cycle election.
Okay. My second question would almost be, I would be interested to have you come back to us, having kind of sorted through if there are 9 hot points here, 8, 10. I wasn't sure how many there were as we went through, and sort of categorize them, maybe ABC, ABC. The A's are like big ticket things that'll get a lot of attention, B's a little less, and C's more administrative. And then tell us if you were to, and I kind of agree with Andre, spread these over different elections. I don't think I'd put 12 things on the next election. But, which ones, what would your strategy be? How many would you try to even get on at once? Hey, let's try a couple of administrative ones that shouldn't be a big deal. And if there's one that HR says, hey, we really need this one because it's impairing our ability to hire, that's not hugely controversial, but that might be in the B category. And I imagine, I would appreciate your opinion. I imagine, although that the more controversial ones would be the ones I'd kind of push off to the future, because they can sink all the others. If you put anything on them, you just get huge resistance. And last comments, if we were to increase the salaries of council members, my 2 cents is I would make it modest. I would not make it look like, I'd make it just, it could be better than today. I mean, it hasn't, $100 a month is like nothing, and then you pay tax on that. But I wouldn't make it very generous. I'd still want to be at the bottom of that chart so that it was clear it was a public service job. We were not doing this thinking it's a full-time job or for money, or the money equation, I think I'd like to see out of it. That's just my opinion. I think we get better people and have when money isn't why they were here. So that's just, those are my thoughts on that.
And if I may provide some clarity about the other cities, I believe there are 5 peer cities that reference the California government code, and that Bakersfield would be at $1,000 a month as your maximum payment for city council members and the mayor. And so that might be a potential option, not trying to instruct your policy decision, but that California then adjusts that rate over time, and then you have parameters built into the process. And that then you're not citing a specific dollar amount in your charter, which then you'd be in this position again in 20, 30 years.
I think that's very a lot of resistance to even that. It's just kind of the way I think Bakersfield is. But, that's not an unreasonable number.
Thank you, Councilmember Freeman. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to clarify there was language stating cleanup items. About how many of that would be that we would think not would be controversial? And also I think what I heard is all of those could be put on one ballot measure if we deemed all of them were not controversial.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Smith, so Mayor and Council. And I think I had anticipated some of Councilmember Freeman's feedback, although I think we could still go back and document this more formally as sort of a prioritization. But I would say the slides that you saw on Article 10 on the detailed procurement and the lighting contracts and Article 9 on the utility franchise, I think those are fairly non-controversial cleanups in my mind. Whereas, I think the other topics, depending on whether it's a priority or not, conflict of interest, I don't think is controversial. I think it's a fairly low bar on that one as well. But may not be a high priority. Other items, I think, though, would be a little more substantive.
So,
If I may give perhaps a little bit of a different opinion.
sure.
I believe that a cleanup item would be things like changing a pronoun from he to he/she, things like that. Again, I think that there are some strategic issues that the council can and will talk about in the future when we come back based on the vice mayor's referral. But to tell the public that something is non-substantive and a cleanup, I don't necessarily think that may be a good approach
maybe
for a charter.
non-controversial is a better term.
I agree with you. I think non-controversial is a better term to use. I would also, again, suggest to the council that particularly on the pay, when we come back, I can give you a detailed history on how many times this has gone to the voters before with an increase in the pay. And suggest again that the use of full-time we should avoid, right? Because we cannot tell a council member that he or she cannot work outside of a city council or dictate that you clock in and clock out. So again, some other type of language that would identify what compensation is appropriate for the city council. Again, those are the types of, I think, discussions that need to be had. And then to determine whether, is that a controversial item or is that not a controversial item? And again, then strategy from the council, well, do you put a controversial item on at the same time then that you put a non-controversial item on, right? They can be two separate measures, but again, council determination as to whether you want it on the same 2024 ballot.
Right.
Yeah,
I got that.
Same analysis again that we had when the council was successful in amending the charter last time.
So you could have 3 or 4 items, I think is what I heard, on one ballot measure that were deemed to be non-controversial.
Yes, if that's what you decided to do, correct. So for example, again, if hypothetically we wanted to change the he to he/she, we would need to think, do we want to go through the charter and identify each and every time that occurs? And is there a way that we can summarize that in a concise fashion? For example, shall the word he be changed to he/she throughout the entire charter? That would, again, off the top of my head, be one way to deal with it, as opposed to citing each time it appears in the charter.
Right. Back to the salary. I mean, I thought your recommendation was you wouldn't put any salary on there. It was just whether or not.
Correct. We don't typically see numbers included within the city charter. So usually there's a process for how are we going to be able to establish and amend elected official compensation. And so usually there's different methods for that. There's, again, that general law. We'll defer to what California puts out into its code. There's also options where it's done by city council. Again, that wouldn't impact the people who are sitting on that council. It would only impact incoming council members. There's also commission options. And so there's a variety of different options. And so you establish, what are you going to follow? Are you going to set it by ordinance and have that process in place? Are you going to use a commission to be able to evaluate salaries, are you going to follow what the government code, I keep saying general law, apologize, the government code says. And so there are different options that are there, but we do not typically see numbers in the charter.
So none of the comparable cities had numbers in the charter?
None of the comparable cities had numbers in the charter. Only Bakersfield City Charter included dollar amount.
On the comparisons, we get health benefits and car allowance and stuff. Was that taken into consideration, or where's that at?
Absolutely. So when we did that analysis, we were only looking at salaries. We did not evaluate the valuation of health benefits, reimbursements, travel, et cetera. And that was consistent for both Bakersfield as well as the peers. So the peers also have health benefits, travel reimbursements, et cetera. None of that extra cost was included in the analysis. We were only looking at salaries. So it was an apples to apples comparison because we didn't include that for any of the peers.
But you have the information, so you could look at total to total.
It may be somewhat difficult to get, but we could try.
So Councilmember, Moss Adams does not have that information as they researched all of the charters, though we've recently completed class and comp and we used the same peer city ordinance, and so I've already planted the seed with human resources to look at doing total compensation analysis for those same cities to look at whether they're getting other fringe benefits as well. But the charge to Moss Adams is really look at the charter to charter, but we can go back and probably through HR get that other data.
So moving over to the civil service, you seem to think that's a more complicated, more long-term, but none of the other, it doesn't seem like it's best practice to have civil service in the charter?
If I may, Mayor, Councilmember Smith, one of the things, if the council decides to go that route and eliminate that, you'll need to eliminate the language, I believe it's in Section 17. And Section 17, our forefathers basically said that the only personnel matters that the council should deal with is those dealing with the city manager and the city attorney. So we would have to amend Section 17 first. The voters would have to take that out, and then you would have to go back and deal with the civil service. So that would be a very good example of the vice mayor's question as to whether or not both of those should be on the ballot at the same time, right? You wouldn't want an inconsistent result there. But again, when we come back, if that's something that you want more analysis on, I'd be more than happy to fill you in on that, because there is a historical context to why our charter reads like that.
Okay, I would appreciate that. Okay, that's all my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Kaur.
Thank you. I wanted to echo and thank Vice Mayor Gonzalez for his referral to explore amending our city charter to include some language around salary, whether there's a number listed or not. I think what our peer cities are doing is working. I think exactly our forefathers were leading a different city. It was not the 9th largest city in the state of California with growing needs. And I cannot express how many residents share their shock at when they realize that the city council is not compensated, whether it's a public role. But also I think it falls in how we're able to respond to constituent services and having the staff and an office that is able to assist our residents in a way that does justice for the needs of our communities. So I think that is a clear gap I've seen in having joined the council and being able to observe that. So I appreciate your analysis and wanted to lend my support as well to the Vice Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Kaur. Councilmember Gray.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I have a little different perspective of this because I feel that, yes, our city definitely has changed over the years. But again, we're talking about a position of public service to serve on the council, which in itself is an honor. And I do not feel that we should increase salaries to the point, and I'm content with what we do now, but to the point where we're just adding more burden on the taxpayers' back. The more we increase the salaries of this dais, the more we have to take away from the services of the city. We can't do it all. There's limited funding. So if we eat up a part of that, then we may have to take money away from Parks and Rec. We may have to take money away from, the utilities, whatever. I mean, all these different departments, police and fire, God forbid. So I think it's really important that we keep our heads screwed on tight here. We have good staff at the city that helps us. We have our help team. So to have extra staff appointed to us as city council members, I do not think that's a necessary thing at all. We've operated the city in an efficient manner to this point, and I think we need to really be careful as we're delving into the charter. Like you said, it's our Constitution. Once you open up the Constitution, a lot of crazy stuff can happen. So it's my feeling that we need to stay as conservative, fiscally conservative as possible, so that those funds can be used to enhance our city and not give us unnecessary support, and that I don't feel that we need. I feel like we have all the support we need in what we're doing today. So thank you. I appreciate your presentation. Good job, too. You're concise and made sense, and it was very clean. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gray. Are there any other requests to speak on this topic? I don't see any other requests to speak.
Motion to receive and file.
You have a motion. Please cast your votes.
Motion is unanimously approved.
Don't see any other items for discussion, and so with that, we stand adjourned at 4:12.